But when I use the term elite community, I'm not talking about a few 100,000 people. I'm talking about the 1.2 billion people who forged ahead of the rest of the world's population, quite astonishingly, including all of us here, over the past 40 years. And that, I think, is really, it is that transnational community which can include 150 million people in China, 75 to 100 million people in India, 20 million people in Brazil, 1.5 million in Kenya, and the majority of people in the North Atlantic countries, Japan and Australasia. That group has forged ahead of most of the rest of the world. And in some ways, if you want a kind of metaphor for the way the world is going at present time, then I would use the example which you may have come across of Heritage Park. I don't know if you're familiar with Heritage Park. Heritage Park is a new housing development. It could be anywhere more or less in the south of the world. It happens to be located about 20 miles east of Cape Town, near the rather popular suburb of Somerset West in the Western Cape District. Heritage Park is a 500-acre development, about 200 hectares, which is basically taken over from an old Boer farm and vineyard. And what is being built there is almost an ideal small town. It's about half built at present. It's going to have a population of about 4,000 people when completed. And it has its shops, it has its high-tech industries, a small theatre, a church, a cricket pitch, some parks, trout streams, conservation areas. In fact, it's pretty ideal. It has a school which will take children, which espouses the Christian principles of fellowship and education. And this is Heritage Park. And it's surrounded by a 33,000-volt electrified fence. And it has just 4 entrances and exits, and it has its own 40-strong security force. In other words, it is a very safe place. In fact, if you look at the website, it actually says on the front page, we are taking the idea of the medieval walled city and applying it to the 21st century. Now, in a sense, what one can see is that is a kind of meta for the way things are going more generally. So what I want to do is look at the really broad trends in international security and feed in the impact in particular of climate change. I mentioned just a moment or two ago that one of the most dominant trends overall is this extraordinary extent of the socioeconomic divisions. It's not generally recognized outside people who actually work in this field. We've had the best part of 30 to 40 years of pretty continual economic growth across most of the world. There are exceptions. There was the Asian downturn, and we have quite a major problem at the present time. But broadly, we have lived in an era of economic growth. What we have not lived in an era is of socioeconomic justice. Because essentially what has happened is one part of the world's community, not identifiably in particular countries, it's a transglobal elite, has forged ahead of the rest quite remarkably. The latest figures from the World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki, which is part of the UN university, now reckons that, 10% of the world's population has 85% of the household wealth. And 50% of the world's population has just 1% of the household wealth. Now, that is the trend worldwide, and there are no signs yet of it actually being curbed. And the indications are, and we will see tomorrow at the G20 summit in Washington, the indications are very strongly that what is actually going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years is, if anything, the divide will widen, because the people who will be squeezed will be the majority on the margins. But that majority is key, because the other major trend, in many ways, is a success story. And that is, over the last 40 years, one of the most remarkable things across the world has been the real improvements in education, literacy, and communications. When I worked in Uganda 40 years ago, this is before Amin, incidentally, the government was striving to provide 4 years of primary education for the majority of kids, but it wasn't there. But essentially, across most of the world, you actually have far higher levels of education, at least a 4 years level, literacy and the rest. And although it's very slow, we're slowly getting some degree of gender equality. We're nowhere near that yet, but it's better than it was. But the point about this is you actually have what you might call the knowledgeable margins, and the margins are the majority of people. That's the key thing. So essentially, some of you from the 1960s and 70s will remember that sociological pop phrase, the revolution of rising expectations, or the consumer revolution. Essentially, what we have now is a revolution of frustrated expectations. And already it is breaking out in all kinds of ways, not least in terms of urban violence and crime. But to give you just 2 specific examples, India is experiencing really very strong and very effective, quite remarkable economic growth, but it's in the hands of a relative few. Everybody thought that the neo-Maoist Naxalite rebellion of 30 years ago had been consigned to the dustbin of history, rather like the Soviet Union. The Naxalites have come back from the margins quite remarkably, and now affect the majority of all the states in India. I think it's 165 districts in 18 out of, I think it's 26 or 27 states. So in other words, there is the revolt from the margins even now. And as far as China is concerned, we've seen over the last few months the extraordinary events in Beijing around the Olympics. Less well known, I'll give you one example, is the huge worries the Chinese authorities have about social unrest. So much so that quite recently they established a new set of task forces, 36 sets, each 600 personnel strong, in all their major 36 cities, devoted solely to advanced public order control. Because each year in China there are many thousands of examples of strikes, riots and unrest because of the way the divisions are widening. Now this is what's happening now. This is before we factor in the environmental issues. And essentially what you see is generally this idea we maintain control, lidism, we don't look underneath at what's happening. So let me move on. I hope you can bear with me because I think the picture, I think, hopefully will be useful today, is to look at what is happening on the environmental side. Because there is a connection, I just want to spend a couple of minutes on the resource side first. And here this does relate very much to fossil fuels because there's a connection again with climate change. The issue here is that one of the very big world trends over the last 80 to 100 years has been what some economic geographers call the resource shift. Any of you who know the North Wales coast around Anglesey will know that extraordinary site known as Parry's Mountain. It's an area of incredible desolation. I think very early episodes of Doctor Who used to use it as some planet in some far-off godforsaken part of the universe. But Parry's Mountain 150 years ago was the world's largest copper mine. And the Industrial Revolution in Britain was actually based on domestic resources. Lead, copper, tin, coal, iron ore, and then obviously water power to some extent. But it was actually all within Britain itself. What has happened in the last 100 years, and now affects very much the United States, is the need for resources from outside the areas of greatest industrialization. And the key example, without question here, is of course oil. Imagine that as a rectangle. Imagine, if you can, really use your imagination, that this measures 1,000 miles north to south and about 400 miles east to west. Put that down over the North Sea 15 years ago, when the North Sea oil reserves were more or less at their height, and you would have about 3.5% of the world's oil reserves under that imaginary rectangle. Pretty useful for Britain, even more useful for Norway. But essentially that was the position then. Take the same imaginary rectangle and put it down over the Persian Gulf. And that actually takes in all the major Gulf and peripheral oil fields, from Abu Dhabi, the East Saudi fields, the offshore Saudi and Abu Dhabi fields, all the Western Iranian fields, all of the Iraqi fields right up to the Kirkuk-Mosul axis, and all the Kuwaiti fields. Underneath that same rectangle, you have currently 61% of all the world's easily extractable oil. You add in the reserves of Russia, Kazakhstan, and Venezuela, you get to over 80%. So in other words, you have quite an extraordinary concentration. And in the case of the two world's really big oil consumers, the United States and China, year by year they become more dependent on imports. 15 years ago, China was self-sufficient in oil, had all it needed for itself. Now, in fact, in next year, 2009, it actually will be importing half of all the oil it needs. The United States is up to nearly 60% oil import dependency. And that goes a long way, and it's beyond the scope of this discussion, to explain the incredible military importance of the Persian Gulf. There's no question about that at all. But I just wanted to leave that to you because I want to come back to, penultimately, just to come back to that because of the relevance. But the big one, without question, and this is a subject for today, is of course climate change.